I think Petro, for his part, the president of Colombia, is acting in a more moral, altruistic way. His support for the Palestinians is based on nothing but morality, right? I mean, he gets nothing out of this. In fact, he gets nothing but a headache. He gets nothing but sanctions. He gets nothing but threats of war, but he's doing it anyway. In fact, when Gustavo Petro became president, I was there. I was at his inauguration. He called on some of the military guard to go to the museum and pull out the sword of Bolivar and bring it to him, and he held it above his head at the inauguration. So, and it will come, as you mentioned, from a Uniting for Peace resolution, which would be the General Assembly agreeing to essentially do a runaround the Security Council.
We have already crossed into that critical mass, and a paradigm shift is about to take place. We see this UN Security Council resolution so readily, just handing the helm, handing the keys to the US and say, you know what, you're in the driving seat again like never before.
I'm baffled, absolutely baffled, as to how countries could have either voted for this. The plan is to put the Palestinians in a smaller concentration camp than they were to begin with.
Welcome to the FloodGate podcast, brought to you by the Palestine Chronicle. I'm your host, Ramzi Baroud. Colombia has taken one of the strongest governmental positions in the world against the genocide in Gaza, cutting diplomatic ties with Israel, backing South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice, and calling for the UN General Assembly to invoke Uniting for Peace to bypass US veto power. In response, Washington has moved against Colombian President Gustavo Petro with sanctions and political pressures. Today on the Floodgate, we speak with Petro's attorney, Dan Kovalik, to examine what this confrontation means, not only for Colombia and the United States, but for the growing role of Latin America in the global struggle for Palestinian rights, and whether a new international alignment is taking shape. If you are new to this channel, please do not forget to subscribe, share, and interact with our content so that more people can benefit from these vital discussions with important guests, analysts, and newsmakers. I am joined by labor and human rights lawyer Daniel Kovalik. Dan served as in-house counsel at the United Steelworkers Union for 26 years at its headquarters in Pittsburgh. While with the USW, he served as counsel for Colombian plaintiffs against US corporations, including the Coca-Cola Company, for alleged human and labor rights violations. He also taught international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law for 12 years. He is the author of a number of books, including The Case for Palestine. Dan, thank you very much for joining us.
It's good to be here. Thank you, Ramzi.
Let me just start asking you about this latest UN resolution that passed, which 2803. It passed on November 17th, which essentially gives the US an equivalent of mandate over Gaza and potentially over the rest of Palestine, this time with the support of Arab and Muslim countries. If you could just share your feelings about this resolution and how it may tie to President Petro's Uniting for Peace initiative.
Yes, well, this was very disappointing, to say the least, upsetting, in fact, because Trump's plan for Gaza, as even the Russian ambassador to the UN said before abstaining on this vote, he said this was a old-time colonial plan, right? As I understand the plan, there will be an occupation force over Gaza. About half of Gaza will be occupied by essentially the U.S. and Israel, and that part will be reconstructed. That'll be the green zone. And then there'll be a red zone, about another half of Palestine, where the Palestinians will live, and that won't even be reconstructed. So, I mean, this is the plan is to put the Palestinians in a smaller concentration camp than they were to begin with, and in one with less, well, frankly, no infrastructure. I mean, I'm baffled, absolutely baffled, as to how countries could have either voted for this or abstained. And again, I'll be honest, I'm especially disappointed in China and Russia for abstaining. And this
You know,
does, yeah.
the Russia and Chinese position is a little bit. I feel like it has to be, we have to be a bit fair. I mean, we understand how politics work, and great powers do not necessarily use some kind of a moral, measuring stick when they make decisions. I mean, they looked at the situation and they said, well, if the Arabs and the Muslims kind of issued a statement in advance telling us they welcome, they embrace this decision by the Trump administration, are we in a position that, where we veto the resolution and be end up being held responsible shall the genocide start all over again in Gaza? I mean, are you willing to entertain that position or that idea?
I'm willing to consider that position, but here's my problem with that. One, the genocide is already continuing. Let's just be totally honest here that the genocide basically slowed down after the ceasefire did not end. And now the Israel and the U.S. have the weather on their side to carry out the genocide. I mean, the cold rains that are happening are displacing huge amounts of Palestinians. Disease is going to spread like wildfire. Israel's only allowing about a third of the aid in that was agreed to, and in the aid that was agreed to was not going to be enough to begin with, right? So the genocide is already happening. I think thousands of Palestinians won't survive the winter, the way things are going. And I think really this Security Council resolution, which hands over Palestine to Trump, essentially ratifies what's happening right now with the more slowly moving genocide. You're right. I mean, the truth of the matter is in almost 99% of cases, states don't act out of altruism or morality. They operate out of realpolitik, and they operate out of their own interests. But first of all, let me say something. The fact that the Arab countries supported this means nothing. These are completely obsequious vassal states of the West that should be ashamed of themselves.
Absolutely.
And I would not, if I were Russian China, care what they think. The other thing is there are countries in the world that at moments in time have shown a certain altruism. A very good example of this is Cuba and its support for Angola and the frontline states against the apartheid South Africa in the 70s and 80s, which ended up liberating Southern Africa and frankly helped overthrow apartheid in South Africa. And Cuba had the full backing of the Soviet Union, which was the predecessor of Russia, of course. I think if the Soviet Union still existed, you might have had a different result at the Security Council. But yeah, Russia is not the Soviet Union. But this brings us then to Gustavo Petro and other Latin countries. So I think Petro, for his part, the president of Colombia, is acting in a more moral, altruistic way. His support for the Palestinians is based on nothing but morality, right? I mean, he gets nothing out of this. In fact, he gets nothing but a headache. He gets nothing but sanctions. He gets nothing but threats of war. But he's doing it anyway, right?
Mm.
And you have Venezuela that's very supportive of the Palestinians. Cuba, which has been supportive of the Palestinians since the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Fidel Castro was a huge supporter of the Palestinian people. Nicaragua. So I think in general, any hope we have is going to come from the global south. And it will come, as you mentioned, from a Uniting for Peace resolution, which would be the General Assembly agreeing to essentially do a run around the Security Council to force a peaceful resolution in Gaza. But that's going to be difficult now, Ramsey, I think, because now that the Security Council says that the U.S. and Israel can put in the forces they want in Gaza as an occupation force or a peacekeeping force, however you want to define that, how does the General Assembly now send in other forces? I mean, to fight those forces. It's virtually impossible. I mean, the fact is, this Security Council resolution may effectively prevent a Uniting for Peace resolution.
And it's interesting that that this act is now is almost like a torpedo to prevent real meaningful action in terms of what the General Assembly can do, whether through Uniting for Peace or any other kind of political margins that they have available to them. But and here's the thing that confuses a lot of people. I mean, we have reached a point during the genocide in which we see countries like Spain, Norway, Belgium, Slovenia, Malta, many others, in addition, of course, to this great mass of countries in the global south on the side of the Palestinians, who are finally translating their rhetoric into action at the International Court of Justice and beyond. And just the moment we began arguing with a certain degree of certainty that we are at a critical mass, or rather we have already crossed into that critical mass, and a paradigm shift is about to take place, we see this UN Security Council resolution so readily just handing the helm, handing the keys to the US and say, you know what, you're in the driving seat again like never before. So do you think that was all rhetoric and hypocrisy, or do you think there was a trick of some kind used by Washington to turn things into Israel's favor at last?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think you'd have to go country by country. I think there's a certain sincerity to it. I think, anyone viewing what's happening in Gaza, any human being with a soul and a heart would have to be disgusted and want this to stop. Okay. But then the question comes down to, what is anyone willing to do to stop it? And what has been shown, sadly, is no one is willing to do much to stop it, if anything, right? So while there may be a sincerity for it to stop, no country has sent in troops. Egypt could have done that, for example. They're right there at the border. They could have just, at least minimally protected their own border, protected the Rafah crossing so aid could get in. They didn't even do that, right? The point is, no one cares enough to make sure that the Palestinians are protected. And there's no question that now the Security Council resolution will prevent that. And it is incredible that the keys to Gaza have now been given not only to the United States, but specifically to Donald Trump, who I think most of the world views as a villainous individual. So now, what did they do to pull that off? I don't know. I couldn't tell you. Again, why would I could see smaller states being cowed by the U.S. because of its superior economic and political and military power, but that's not true with Russia and China. I think these abstentions will go down in history as a great betrayal, Ramsey. I really
So,
believe that.
and you said we can talk about this case by case. Well, let's look at Colombia. I mean, Colombia is one of those countries. Yes, other South American and Latin American countries have done some impressive measures in solidarity with Palestine, but Colombia kind of led the way in many ways. It recalled its ambassador, eventually cutting ties with Israel. It backed South Africa at the International Court of Justice. It hosted, conferences and initiatives that were aimed at creating an alternative international political and legal body to counter that of US and Western hegemony over Palestine and the Middle East. So they have done so much in that from that perspective. Now, of course, the US is responding, and the response is, of course, they're not saying that we are punishing the President Petro, because of his stance in Gaza, but we all know that this is the case. If you could just walk us through what Colombia has done and why did that kind of raise the ire of the US, from the very start, or like briefly, if you will.
Well, as you said, I mean, Petro and Colombia have been more and more vocal against the genocide in Gaza. As you say, cutting off diplomatic ties, cutting off economic ties. And by the way, Colombia and Israel before Petro were very close. Israel did a lot of military training in Colombia. Actually, they're very responsible for training and supporting the death squads, the paramilitary death squads in Colombia. In fact, Carlos Castaño, who founded the AUC paramilitaries with his brother, he wrote a book, a memoir, and in it he says he owes his life and his country to Israel.
Mm.
And this is a guy responsible for killing tens of thousands of innocents in Colombia. So Israel has had this very close connection, frankly, with the worst elements in Colombia, right? So for Petro to then cut ties with Israel was a huge move for him, and a dangerous move, by the way. Could get him killed, in fact. But in addition to that, he's been very vocal at the United Nations. Very shortly before he was put on this blacklist, this OFAC list, he gave a very impassioned speech at the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York City. And he talked about the need for a military force to protect Gaza. And I think that given the timing of the OFAC list designation, I think it's very clear that that speech got him into very hot water with the Trump administration. And he has not backed down, and he won't back down on Gaza or Palestine. Petro's a revolutionary himself. He was a guerrilla himself in the 80s, I believe. And, so he is a revolutionary. He supports revolutionaries. He supports the right to self-determination like those amongst the Palestinians. And so clearly one of the reasons the U.S. is going after him and his family, he's also put Petro's wife and one of his sons on the OFAC list, I do think is to try to quiet him and isolate him on the issue of Palestine.
And so what you're essentially saying here, this is not about political convenience. There is two branches to this conversation. Number one is that the president is fully committed to Palestine because of his commitment to the rights of his own people. This is intersectionality, not in an academic sense, intersectionality in a real sense. The Colombian people know exactly what oppression is like, what colonialism is like, what this kind of violence is like. They have experienced it on kind of on a first-hand basis, but also they also know what Israel is capable of doing. It's not like they are looking at Palestine as this distant subject far away and they are just taking a moral stance. No, Israel has done a lot of harm in Colombia, and they are also approaching it from that viewpoint.
Well, absolutely. Although I don't think Petro's mentioned that, but you're right. I mean, I think that is true, that he knows that Israel's played a very horrible role in his own country. Again, as Carlos Castaño himself pointed out. And so, as you say, there is a way in which he's also defending his own people. But I think a lot of it does come down to third world solidarity. You know, people don't mention the third world anymore. They don't call it that. But I still do. I feel a certain emotion about the third world, which is now called the global south. And I think there is a solidarity amongst those poor countries
And
in the
I'm
back.
glad that you
Yeah.
say this, Dan, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm also passionate about the global south. And, because, that's where the politics of solidarity did not start at a Harvard lecture. It started in the global south. And we know what Cuba has done, what the PLO used to do, what so many of these countries have done for.
Gaddafi did, yes, yes.
Exactly. But then the question is, why South America in particular seems to be the one that's still kind of carrying the mantle of third world or global south solidarity. Yes, we have seen Namibia, South Africa, hands down, and others, but South America and Latin America is still at the forefront of that fight. Why do you think, what makes that region more unique in a sense?
I think 500 years of struggle against first Spanish colonialism, and you had people like Simon Bolivar from what was known as Greater Colombia, which includes Venezuela and Colombia, who fought successfully against the Spanish in liberating the Andean region of South America. He's still very important. In fact, when Gustavo Petro became president, I was there. I was at his inauguration. He called on some of the military guard to go to the museum and pull out the sword of Bolivar and bring it to him, and he held it above his head at the inauguration. So you have these figures like Petro, like Maduro, like Chavez, who are still very much inspired by the example Bolivar. You have people, of course, in Cuba. You had Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, who were inspired by the liberator Jose Marti. You have Daniel Ortega, who's in power in Nicaragua, who was the leader of the Sandinistas, who overthrew the U.S.-backed dictator in Nicaragua. So there is this revolutionary history in Latin America that, other countries have had that, other regions have had that, but I think it's unique there. I mean, I think it's particularly militant. It has been particularly successful. Again, I think really, really beginning with the Mexican Revolution in 1910, which even preceded the Russian Revolution of 1917. A lot of people forget that, right? And then of course, you have Haiti, which even before that, in the early 1800s, overthrew French colonialism and slavery. But I think really the modern manifestation of this anti-imperialist militancy was the Cuban Revolution in 1959, which continues to reverberate not only in Latin America but in the world. And Fidel Castro was one of the people who equated the liberation of all humanity with the liberation of the Palestinian people. He was very, very explicit about that. Che Guevara even visited Gaza. There's photos of Che in Gaza, I think in 1965, something like that. Chavez used to wear a keffiyeh, so does Maduro at times, and Petro wears a keffiyeh. There's a lot of Palestinians actually in Venezuela. When I was in Venezuela fairly recently, I met with some Palestinians there. Who they've been very welcoming to Palestinians in Venezuela. So there's just a history of solidarity with the world, and particularly with Palestine in that region.
Absolutely. In fact, Cuba was one of the first countries to provide medical, medical school scholarships to hundreds, if not more than hundreds, of Palestinian doctors. Some of our best doctors graduated from Havana over the years. And Che Guevara, he did visit Gaza, in fact, and he visited my refugee camp in Gaza. And that
Wow.
visit, yeah,
Wow.
absolutely, it registered among the people of Gaza. In fact, I grew up in a socialist family that kind of made from that visit. I don't know how to say it, but it was kind of the pinnacle of socialism in Gaza. And don't forget, long before Hamas, long before the Islamic Jihad, Gaza was the hub for socialist struggle in the 1960s and 70s. There were no one but the socialists at the time, the Communist Party, the PFLP, and others. So Che Guevara's visit, I think, kind of cemented that kind of relationship. And you kind of see the extension of that solidarity, not only surviving until this day, but thriving as well. Now, back to Colombia, but extending that discussion to Venezuela. Why? I mean, is the U.S. thinking that, I mean, they have been trying to tame, for the lack of a better word, South America for such a long time, from the days of the Monroe Doctrine until today, time after time, war after war. But that region remains not only rebellious, but actually provides real models, real examples of how socialism can actually work and function and make a big difference in the lives of people. Why are they coming? Why is Trump in particular, who's supposedly the anti-war president, why is he so keen on going back to South America, wants to launch wars and regime change? I mean, does he think that that area is now vulnerable to this extent?
He might, and there's some reason to believe that. I mean, you look at Argentina, which took a hard turn to the right. Apparently, Chile is expected to take a hard turn to the right in these upcoming elections. Bolivia, of course, took a hard turn to the right in the last elections. So, and Ecuador is now firmly in the hands of the right wing. So, yeah, I do think they smell blood in the water.
Mhm.
They want to finish off what was known as the pink tide, right, which Chavez ushered in 1999 with his election, and the that spirit of leftism and progressivism spread throughout the region. And again, that's now contracting a bit. Cuba is now very weakened economically due to very stringent sanctions by the United States. Venezuela has been weakened greatly by sanctions. So, yeah, I think they see a chance to finish off at least the most recent manifestation of anti imperialist leadership in the region. I also think they're frustrated by things that are happening abroad, by their inability to win in Ukraine, by by what's happening in Gaza, certainly, which has totally undermined the credibility of the West. And so I think some of it is a pivoting back to where they feel most comfortable, right, is in the Western Hemisphere. Um, Again, with the Monroe Doctrine that was enunciated in 1823, they see themselves as continuing to defend that, to defend the U.S.'s claimed right to be the only country that has any, prerogative to have influence in the region. So I think they see a chance for a victory here. After a long, you know, string of losses. For example, in Afghanistan after 20 years. Um, and they want the oil. Venezuela has more oil reserves than any country in the world. And, at various times, Trump has been very open about the fact that that's what he wants there. So, for all those reasons, Latin America is now a focus of the United States, much to their detriment.
Of course. Of course, this reminds me a great deal of what happened in Iraq during the process, after the process of sanctions from the early 1990s all the way to the war in 2003. They basically depleted that country. I visited Iraq during the time of sanctions, and people were just exhausted. They had even even pencils were not allowed into Iraq during the sanctions because they claimed that you could use the lead of pencils to make weapons of mass destruction. It was so ridiculous and so absurd, but in a way it kind of worked because they did manage to exhaust the collective and deplete the country from within, and to invest in this corrupt class within Iraq itself that was ready to receive the occupiers as they did arrive to come to Iraq. But of course, the ending was not to their liking. Iraq is right now is number one, or China is number one trade partner with Iraq, not the United States. Do you feel like there's an element of surprise that could be waiting for them in Venezuela? Shall they take the insane step of actually attacking Venezuela directly, or do you think that this is going to be kind of like a cakewalk, as the Bush administration described the Iraq War?
Yeah, well, of course, the Iraq War ended up not being a cakewalk, as we all know. And Venezuela would not be either. I mean, you have 8 million people who've joined the militias to defend Venezuela. I mean, the U.S. doesn't have forces anywhere near that. The U.S., in fact, if they truly invaded, if they had a ground invasion of Venezuela, I think they would be confronted by a resistance that would, look like Vietnam. In fact, they say if a country wants to defeat an insurgency, they need to have something like a 10-to-1 advantage over that insurgency in terms of troops, and it would be the reverse. With Venezuela having over a 10-to-1 advantage over the United States. So it's really the U.S. would be clobbered, I think. So I don't think they will do that. I think if they do some sort of military action, it's going to be some sort of strategic bombing, like the one they did in Iran, for example.
Perhaps with the hope that the military could carry out a coup, as they have tried in the past,
Right.
and try to sort it out basically within Venezuela without direct American intervention.
Yes, I think that is their hope.
Mm. Now, I don't want to put you on the spot here, Dan, but you are involved in various legal mechanisms, in the U.S. case against President Petro and his family, but in other areas as well. So, if you could explain to us, if you feel comfortable, with what is happening exactly, and do you really believe that the very country that violates not only international law but its own laws as well in many ways is actually capable of finding justice for someone like President Petro?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think that there's a long there's a long road that would need to be you know navigated for that to happen. But I also think Petro, as president of Colombia, has some leverage here, has some things that would allow him to possibly negotiate a solution to the situation. So, all those things will be explored.
Okay, all right. Back to Gaza, back to what's happening in Gaza right now. And again, thank you very much for taking the time. I know you have very limited and precious time, but I don't want us to leave our viewers with any sense of despair regarding Gaza. We know the
Yes.
situation is very difficult. We are talking about a genocide here, and it's not easy to find hope. Amid genocide, and now genocide that is culminated to so many other things. People are dying from sicknesses and easily treatable diseases, from polluted water, being drowned in their tents, and so forth and so on. Yet at the same time, they remained. They did not rush to Egypt. They did not beg the Egyptians to take them. They remained entrenched and rooted in their land, and they refused to leave. And ultimately, it's the Palestinian people who have defeated these kind of machinations in the past. I mean, this UN Resolution 2803 is not the first attempt at finding political ways to coerce the Palestinians and to finish off their cause. It's just, its history is filled with these examples, from the Roger Plan to Camp David to Oslo and to many others. Do you feel like this time around is different? Do you feel like they could actually find a way to prevail? I'm talking about the Israel and other imperialist forces along with the US.
I mean, the only way they could prevail is by finishing off the Palestinians. I mean, and I feel like that is the goal here. I mean, that's what makes it a genocide. I mean,
Mm,
I think they want to destroy every man, woman, and child in Palestine, including in the West Bank. I mean, you're seeing a lot of increased aggression in the West Bank, too, by the settlers and by the military as well. But I do think that that will not be an easy thing for them to do. I think there will be resistance, and I do think more than one country will end up stepping forward to maybe intervene to stop this, right? I mean, you could have a change of leadership, for example, in Egypt,
mhm.
in Turkey, in Jordan. Um, there's a lot of potential candidates who could help the Palestinians. And I think with some time, if they can hold out long enough, I hope that help will come. But they've shown themselves to be very resilient, as you say, and I mean heroic, absolutely
Absolutely.
heroic. Um, Not just by surviving, but by thriving, by
Mm.
even finding happiness and gratitude in a terrible situation. Really, all of us should learn how to live through the Palestinians, right? They teach us how to live, how to be human. And that's, why it's so important to defend those people. I mean, they are the best part of us. I do think that. I really sincerely believe that. And to save them is to save humanity. So I think there's enough of that sentiment. I trust the world has not fallen so badly that the world will totally, you know, um, just let this happen. We'll let the destruction of the Palestinians happen. But I think we are seeing a setback for sure in
Mhm.
the Security Council resolution. But we have to speak out against it. I mean, we need to educate people that, hey, this is a very bad step, and you know it needs to be fought very hard.
And I was planning to finish with something related to this. There was incredible amount of solidarity globally. It started somewhat slow, but it eventually manifested itself to massive popular movements, especially in countries like Spain and Italy, that we did not expect to see this kind of response from them regarding the Israeli genocide in Gaza. And you also have this kind of new consciousness about Palestine that is
Yes,
totally unprecedented in the struggle for Palestine and Palestinian rights. Yes, we had the heydays of solidarity with Palestine in the 70s and up to the early 1980s, but not to this degree and not globally to this extent. And we know much of this had a lot to do with social media and all new factors. But what do you think the world should be doing right now that supposedly the genocide has stopped or slowed down or changed tactics? Do you fear that that momentum, it will slow down and thus will allow Israel to carry out and finish off the Palestinians and the genocide without having to deal with this great global reaction that made life very difficult on Israel and in many ways turned Israel into a pariah state in many parts of the world?
yes. Well, I think that is the danger, and I think that was the goal of Israel and the U.S. in doing this sleight of hand. Claiming they've agreed to a ceasefire when they have not agreed to a ceasefire, right?
Mhm.
Um, I think it has lulled a lot of people to sleep. Um, And again, the way that that won't happen is by people like us continuing to point to what's happening, to continue to say people continue to be killed there. And by the way, not just in Gaza, but in South Lebanon, right? The Israelis attacked a Palestinian refugee camp in South Lebanon, I believe, yesterday.
Yeah, Ain
We
al-Hilwa,
need,
11 people, or 13 people rather, were killed in the Ain al-Hilwa massacre. Absolutely.
yes, we need to keep the spotlight on Palestine
Mhm.
and on the Palestinian suffering and on the genocide. That is how we will prevent people from withdrawing from this struggle. So that is our mandate.
Dan Kovalik, you have done your job and a lot more, and not just recently during the genocide, but for a very long time. Your defense of workers and labor unions and your solidarity with the Palestinians, with other nations in the Middle East and South America, using every mechanism in your disposal to make that happen, makes you a role model in so many ways. And we thank you for your leadership and for your guidance, and of course for taking the time to talk to us today. Thank you very much, Dan.
Ramsey, it was my honor and pleasure. And you are a great leader yourself, an advocate. And I'm just proud to be associated with you, to be honest. So thank you.
You are too kind. Thank you very much, Dan.